Hello? Hello?
Oh, yeah, she did, but I tried to connect her.
Understands it.
I'm amazed, Rick.
The December 15, 2017 meeting of the Governance and Policy Committee of the University of Minnesota Board of Regents will now come to order. I'll ask folks to make their way to their seats. We've got a healthy agenda here today. And I believe we have Regent Simmons on the phone. Is that correct?
Thank you, Chair Rocha. Yes, I'm here.
Well, welcome, and pleased to have you with us today. We'll move right into the first item, the Board of Regents Policy Reservation and Delegation of Authority Approval Thresholds. This matter is up for review, and I would ask Senior Vice President Brian Burnett and Executive Director and Corporate Secretary Brian Steeves to please join us at the table. And you may proceed in whichever order you would choose.
Well, good Friday morning to members of the Board of Regents. I'm pleased to be here today. Executive Director Brian Steeves and I will continue the committee's discussion from your October meeting regarding board approval thresholds. Can you hit them? Thank you. So just for review for the board, back in October, we discussed principles to guide review of your approval thresholds. This month, we're going to talk about some proposed amendments, and then consider if the board's willing and feels comfortable, we would talk about potential action or amended thresholds at the February meeting. So today's just to continue and further that discussion. As a reminder, in October, the committee discussed a set of principles that we have used in reviewing and recommending changes to the thresholds. One, continue to strengthen public confidence in the university's decision-making processes. Two, we want to ensure board oversight of university operations is right-sized and at the right level. Three, we want to align thresholds for potentially considering consistency across types of projects and purchases. And four, obviously we want to avoid surprises that have the potential to create public relations risks for the board and for the institution. So this chart, which I think is really illustrative, shows you where they currently are. And I think we brought this to you last month. They're spread across 6 dollar values that range from $250,000 to $5 million. And these are the 6 different types of transactions or actions governed by your current policy. And they include capital plans and budgets, real property, both leases and sale of or purchase of properties, facilities, purchasing, other, and then an umbrella threshold regarding any commercial transactions and matters not otherwise covered. So kind of a catch-all is there at the end. So for the committee's consideration, we would like you to think about maybe lining these up into some general buckets, into these thresholds. In a moment, I'll talk about the reasoning behind these recommended changes, but first, just let me walk through the changes. We reduced the number of thresholds really to 2 dollar levels. We're suggesting you consider $2 million and $5 million. We've maintained an additional category to capture the non-monetary thresholds, and that's that additional column out to the right. And as we walk through this, we wanted to make sure that there's really 2 purposes here. First, we want to ensure focused oversight for the board. And when we looked at the principles discussed earlier, we speak about oversight as right-sized and at the right level. We believe these recommended thresholds meet that principle. And with one exception, which I'll describe shortly, these thresholds match up well with what we see from our peers. And there are a few, if any, noteworthy items that the board wouldn't see any longer, and I can speak to that shortly as well. Second, we wanted to create consistency and alignment of like transactions. This meets another of the principles that we discussed back in October, and we have grouped purchases of all types into the $2 million category. We have aligned annual capital decisions with the major purchases at $2 million, with the belief that these are more in the here and now category. And we've grouped the more visionary or long-term planning type items under the $5 million category. And the commercialization of technology change would better align with the existing board policy language in your policy that is the commercialization of intellectual property rights. The next few slides will provide information on the effect of changing these thresholds. This table represents the effect of increasing the purchase of goods and services threshold from 1 to 2 million. As you can see, if the $2 million threshold had existed in FY16, the board would have approved 7 fewer purchases amounting to $10 million, or roughly 2% of all purchases approved. The impact in FY17 would have been 12 purchases amounting to about $14.7 million, or 3%. So again, you're still going to see over 90% of what's already being brought to you. And in the examples of what wouldn't be brought to you would be printing paper stock at $1.6 million, corn cob and animal bedding at $1.5 million, leasing 1,400 notebook computers for Crookston students at $1.5 million, the always entertaining campus-wide pest control services at $1.1 million, and support services for study abroad programs at $1 million. So those are the kinds of things you wouldn't see if you considered these thresholds. This table represents the effect of increasing the real property threshold from 1.25 to 2 million. As you can see, if the $2 million threshold had existed in FY16, the board would have approved one fewer item amounting to 1.6 million, or about 2% of the total. Likewise, the impact in FY17 would have been one item amounting to 1.3 million, or 1%. So an example would be the use of TCF Bank Stadium by the NHL was a $1.6 million contract, and the purchase of 627th Avenue Southeast was $1.3 million. So those are examples of transactions the board wouldn't see if you went to these new thresholds. Slide. This table represents the effect of increasing the capital budget project and amendments threshold from 500,000 to 2 million. As you can see, the 2 million threshold, if it had existed in FY15, the board would have approved 13 fewer capital projects, amounting to about 37% of the total approved. The impact in 16 would have been 7 items, amounting to 28%, and in 17, 8 items amounting to about 50%. When we look at these amendments over a 3-year span, the board would have approved 5 fewer capital budget amendments amounting to about 26% of the total. And examples in this category, just a few: the Crookston Sahlstrom Hall Center for Collaborative Research at $515,000, the Morris Student Center remodel at $971,000, Duluth Griggs for field turf replacement at $1 million. These are the kinds of things that wouldn't come to the board if you looked at these thresholds. And as we looked at this in our review and analysis of thresholds, we looked to our peers in the Big Ten to see where we sat in comparison, at least with our current thresholds. And as it pertained to capital projects, we found a wide range of from 185,000 in Wisconsin to 10 million at Penn State. The average thresholds range from 2 to 3 million. For goods and services, the thresholds range from 400,000 at Nebraska to not required at 4 institutions whatsoever. And the average of those requiring approval was around 2 million. And then for real property, leases range from 100,000 to 10 million and from 5 to 30 years. And purchase of services sales range from $1.25 million threshold to every transaction had to be approved by the board. So as I mentioned before, there was one exception to our alignment with our peers, and this is it. We are currently we are at the 1.25 million university, with several of our peers requiring board approval for all purchase and sale of property. We believe that our proposal, though different from our peers, better aligns our transactional activity, whether it be real property, purchase of goods or services, or capital projects. Finally, we know that regardless of the final levels decided by the board, if any, there will be transactions that fall below the threshold and are noteworthy enough to demand board awareness and approval, such as the NHL lease of TCF Bank Stadium. We would continue to bring these to the board, meeting the principles of strengthening public confidence and avoiding surprises. So that's my part of it, and I think I'm going to turn over to Executive Director Steves for talking about the appointments and umbrella language for you today. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Senior Vice President Burnett. I think that my portion of the presentation would be appropriately themed the bad penny portion of the presentation, because the board has discussed the appointments authority and umbrella language 7 previous times between March 2016 and July of 2017, ending in a 6-6 tie vote on language that was in front of you, which caused that language to fail. So I'm back, and here we'll go at it again. This will be the 8th discussion. The reason that this is back before you is because this topic has been tackled by at least 2 of the board's committees. There have been votes that have advanced language to the board on at least 2 occasions, and the board has grappled with it. And there was a strong desire, I think, to still try to figure out a way to get to language that could garner support of a majority. And so as work planning progressed for the Governance and Policy Committee this year, board leadership asked the committee leadership to take a shot at looking at this language and seeing if there might be some consensus language that could emerge. And so what you have in front of you today was developed in consultation with committee leadership and is really for consideration, understanding that there has been a long history here. There are a number of issues and opinions about how this language should or should not look, and it's not to. It's simply offered up for a conversation to see if there might be some common ground that can be reached. So what this language does is it establishes a threshold requiring board approval for employment agreements that create a contractual obligation over an amount determined by the board, and that dollar amount is not even included in there. It's a blank in the document right now. So what this does is takes a slightly different approach than what the board has previously seen. It actually takes the approach of looking at employment agreements almost like we look at purchases of goods and services for a multi-year contract. So say we were going to purchase a good or service, and say that contract was over 3 or 4 years and it had an option for an extension, and maybe there were performance incentives built into it, and there were a whole variety of complex parameters built into this contract. The administration would look at the contract, they would evaluate it, they would add up what the total possible value of the contract is, and they would determine whether it meets the threshold that the board has set, so $1 million, for instance. What this language is doing is saying that same logic should apply to an employment agreement. There are very few employees at the University of Minnesota that receive a multi-year employment agreement, but the same logic would apply. If that multi-year employment agreement exceeded with whatever guarantees were in there, incentive pay or whatever kind of analysis goes into the current type of contracts that are for goods and services, that would then trigger the threshold for it requiring board approval. So it's a very simplistic kind of approach, one that you haven't seen exactly in this iteration previously, but one that's being offered up as a possible option for you. It also, the language that you see in your docket also clarifies that significant amendments to board approved employment agreements are also subject to board approval. So one of the items that was considered yesterday by Finance and Operations and will be considered later by the full board is, in fact, an amendment to an employment agreement that previously came to the board. That employment agreement, as you all know, is not required to come. It was kind of by agreement that the head football coach contract is coming. But the amendment thereto would also be triggered under the language that is being proposed in your docket. It also does some cleanup. It adds vice chancellors for academic affairs to the list of positions requiring board approval. There's good rationale for this because right now we have deans on the required list, and that means that we have deans on system campuses who are required to have board approval for their employment agreement, but the people that they report to are not required to have board approval. And so this is a simple cleanup, and it makes a couple other minor corrections in that language. It also tries to offer some language to clarify the umbrella language that we call it, and I'll just jump over to that. It attempts to take out the very vague term commercial transaction and simply say that the board approval would apply to any matter not otherwise reserved in other specific portions of the policy, if that matter aligns with any of the three subparts. And I'll just note, as we've been talking about these thresholds, letter C on this page, the $2 million threshold, was put in place in 2010, so it's not a long-standing dollar threshold. The other language has a longer history, but the $2 million threshold has been more recent, and it was done at the time when the board decided to move the purchases of goods and services up to $1 million. And so when that threshold was adjusted, the board also added this $2 million threshold. And so as you're considering whether to adjust other thresholds, you may want to also consider whether the $2 million aligns with that or works in concert with that, with other changes that you want to make. But we haven't presupposed anything in this language here. And then this is just the appointment authority language, so that you have that in front of you as well. And with that, we would be happy to gather input and stand for questions.
Thank you very much. Before we open the floor, I would just make a couple of comments. One is that the 6-6 vote, where the language failed, the language was reinforcing the language that was already in existence. So we weren't approving the language that was already there. It had kind of a strange procedural posture that day. But I would make a clarification that with Regent Beeson, Vice Chair of this committee, you mentioned that this was coming forward based on our conversation. That wasn't an endorsement of the specific language. It was this format of having this conversation and looking at what was being brought forward. So I don't want to give the impression that there was already a statement by the committee leadership on that. And so with that, we will open the floor to any questions or comments related to the presentation and the proposals that are before us. Again, this is for review. Regent McMillan.
Thank you, Chair Rocha. I think that what we have today that we didn't have the last couple times we looked at this was this committee's excellent work and the administration's work and our board leadership team's work to put those tables together that you find in the material today that lay out all of the various commercial contract approval. Everything's before us now, and we haven't had anything quite that comprehensive. So my comment at this point is simply one of acknowledgement and thank you for flushing out, I think, what's a complex array of policies, approval protocols, and perspectives. So I'm grateful.
Thank you. Regent Beeson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the placement of this topic on the committee's work plan and in a comprehensive way. I think it is helpful to look at all the thresholds at the same time, and then starting with some proposed, at least clarifying language, because these things get built over a number of years, and if you step back and really look at them the way that they are presented today. It is hard to sort of understand some of that logic. Back up to this one. I told the chair I'm not really committed to any numbers on any of these at this point. I'd like to hear what others think and process. In general, I will just say I like an increase in the commercial purchases level. Although none of this makes that much material difference because the number of transactions are few that would be allowed through or prohibited, so I don't think it's particularly major. But I do like higher levels of commercial. I get a little nervous about the commercial real estate or the capital, and maybe Mr. Bertelsen can talk about this. And I've never sat on the facilities committee, but the idea of going up to $5 million on multi-year capital, those are visible projects, and those and the new capital 6-year plan you've now put in projects that don't have any dollar, which I like, which is sort of a placeholder. So those I wouldn't want those to disappear. And I would also ask what people think about not seeing the schematics. I thought that added value, schematics before we go from initial review to final project review.
Thank you, Regent Beeson. We'll go to President Keeler for some remarks, and then Regent Simmons, if you would like the floor, we'll check with you following the President's remarks. President Keeler.
Thank you, Chair Rocha. I'd like to speak to the appointment language and the umbrella language and ask the board's indulgence, perhaps. We have to execute these policies as an administration, and that appointment and umbrella language is far easier to execute if we have a list of positions rather than a dollar value that is done as a result of a a computation? Does it include bonuses? Does it include at-risk compensation? Does it include benefits, optional years, et cetera? It just gets to be complicated. And should the board wish to approve appointments, I believe the board should be able to list the positions that they would like to approve. And that just becomes mechanistically a much more operational issue than calculating a dollar value, number one. Number two, if you do calculate a dollar value, I really think you need to reflect on the fact that a great many faculty appointments, by the time you include startup dollars and other long-term obligations, if it's a tenured appointment, how many years does that appointment go for, and how many years do we multiply the annual salary by to get to some level, et cetera. It gets to be complicated and frankly ambiguous. I think in general, the spirit that I've heard in most of these discussions is that it would not be appropriate to include faculty appointments in this subsection 2. For tenured appointments, you already approve those. The budgetary structure for providing the startup funds is already approved as part of the overall budget of the university, so it feels to me to be redundant and cumbersome, and additionally potentially non-competitive, hurting our competitiveness if we have to do that. So I would urge a specific listing of positions, not dollar amount, the exemption of faculty appointments from that. In regard to subsection 6, the umbrella language is exactly that, and that is going to, I think, trump anything. Sorry about that. Value that you put in place elsewhere. So if at the end of the day, anything that has a value greater than $2 million is subject to board approval, then this in front of you is in fact the policy. So I'm not sure how you would want to get around that, but to conclude, the idea of listing specific positions would help us implement this, and I think be more transparent. And secondly, exempting faculty from that appointment language, I think, would be prudent. Thank you.
Thank you, President Kaler. Before we go to Regent Simmons, I want to just speak to that a little bit, in part because there's a historical background to this. For one, I note that the interplay between the list of employees that automatically come to the board and the dollar threshold is a long-standing one, and the two components of it have different purposes, as was in the legislative history of the appointment policy. When the board in '95, right after I had left, a couple months after I had left, they had changed the list to remove some of the athletic coaches from the list of positions approved by the board. The response from the administration, from the president at the time, was, based on the dollar amounts, these will still come before the board, and specifically cited the umbrella language and saying that these, because the contracts are above that. And we've talked about this before. My understanding is that the two purposes of having these approval thresholds or directives, one is, the main one, the umbrella, is, well, I'll start with the employment. The reason that we list the specific positions isn't because of a financial consideration, it's because of their impact on the mission of the institution. The people that are the leaders, academic and otherwise, with the institution. So that's not a financial risk issue. The other language is, and this is about financial risk. And so when you talk about contracts that are at that level, the purpose of having a threshold is to say anytime we're going to expose the public's university to a certain dollar amount of risk, that it would then come to the board for approval. And so, from my perspective, as we go forward before our next meeting to discuss this for action, is and something I'm very interested in would be examples of where we were not competitive because we had a requirement for the board to review the contract as well as the startup money and as well as the tenure component, because we're already reviewing every tenure hire. That already comes before the board. So you can suggest, one, you can say it's redundant. The other part you can say is there are two different components of it, and those are already being considered by the board, so it really doesn't create a great deal of additional work. It just lets the board understand that we're exposing the institution to financial risk. So I would want to just make sure that we understand that kind of historic interplay between those two components. Regent Simmons, would you like to take the floor at this point, or I can check back with you as well?
I would like to take the floor at this point. Thank you, Chair Rocha. First, I want to thank the leadership of the committee and the administration for really trying to bring forward to us a principled and practical policy, and I really appreciate it. I will share that I have a couple of position issues with respect to this and a finalized version that might look a lot like this policy. And it's really based on the fact that I would consider positions and real estate different than goods and services. And on goods and services, I like these new thresholds, and I think it'll make for better management. With respect to real estate, I think it's harder there to put dollar values because some of that is going to be market-driven. The value of real estate in Crookston or Morris might be different than in downtown Minneapolis, for example, and therefore something of very high strategic significance might not fall in the threshold in one location and it wouldn't in another. So I do think we have to consider the strategic implications. For example, what if we started buying up pieces of land in a place like Rochester or Crookston, where maybe the land was cheaper than it was in the Twin Cities, and we could be accumulating, but we ought to know that, and the board, me, ought to approve that strategic direction. Maybe more than just the purchase of each piece of land, but make sure that that land purchase was in a board-approved. And the same holds for selling real estate. Again, there can be long-term implications of that. Then with respect to the people, I come back to two things. One, I'm fine now, well, kind of fine, with the Regents approving some of the high-level coaches because I've accepted the fact they are of high impact. They get a lot of attention. And these are really, this is a very complex industry right now. So you have moved me, colleague, to being able to see the wisdom there. With respect to positions in general, though, I would remind us of this. At any salary level, a person in a leadership position could have very high impact, as Regent Rocha said, and could also control a very big budget. So there actually are financial implications of their stewardship and fulfillment of the mission. So I think we have to be very careful not to assume that only the highest paid people are going to impact. I like the idea of a list of key positions. And the other big problem, and President Kaler pointed it out, and I will echo it, is there are some faculty positions that could reach a threshold very easily that we might set. And that would be particularly true in places like the medical school, the dental school, where some fields, because of market forces, not impact, but market forces, could throw people at that threshold. So those are my comments, and they're made with the intent, I want to move forward on something that looks very much like what's been presented today. And I'm just trying to work through some of these issues. And I think you colleagues and administration can help with that.
Thank you, Regent Simmons. To get a clarification, I believe that the list would still remain under the current proposal. Am I correct in that? The list of appointments. I didn't know if there was a sense that we would no longer have a list, Regent Simmons, but is that what you were asking or suggesting?
No, my expectation is we would continue to have a list talking about making sure we understand that list should always represent impact, and that impact can be financial.
Right.
Delivering the costs money and puts our resources and our assets at risk. I was just making that differentiation. So I'm assuming there will be a list.
Okay.
I still have to go with the dollar threshold for the reason I said, but again, I'm looking for a point where we go, that's pretty reasonable. Let's do it.
Thank you very much. Senior Vice President Burnett.
One thing, Regent Simmons and members of the board, to clarify back on the slide of the proposed thresholds, currently anything over 10 acres, irrespective of price, is your current threshold. So our rationale was to make it more of a dollar-based and take out the 10, because to Regent Simmons' point, 10 acres in where a research and outreach center is a very different value than 10 acres in downtown Minneapolis or near the campus. And so I just neglected to tell you that the current threshold is 10 acres, so irrespective of price. So our suggestion was, and it's just a suggestion in the proposed thresholds, was to remove that and just make it a dollar-based value for some consistency. But it's clearly up to the board's comfort level if that's something you want to entertain. So I just wanted to clarify that I neglected to tell you where the current threshold is on that additional column in that one slide, if you can back that up there.
Regent Simmons, did you want to respond?
Only to say that I still have a little trouble, and you can probably help me work through this, and if it's only my problem, I will drop it. But real estate has tremendous impact on mission, whether we sell certain parcels of 5 acres or buy certain parcels of one city block. Vice President Burnett, you do see what I'm driving at there?
Mr. Chairman, Regent Simmons, I totally understand that there could be a small purchase that could be a part of a bigger thing, and I think that's about building the trust between the administration and the board. I believe we would report to any of these to you, and anything that had implications to go above $2 million, we can certainly think about it. Today you're at $1.25 million, so anything below $1.25 million we can do and report to you. But I think that we can certainly think about real estate if it has bigger implications or that type of thing. We could actually maybe think about that language between now and February that would help you with that.
All right.
That would be very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. And I have Regent Hsu on the list next. Is this related to what was, if not, I just want to make one comment about property. The thing that strikes me about property, as we've seen with matters of recent note, they're often hidden costs. You talk about the purchase price of a parcel of property, but once you start breaking ground, you can find histories and land that expose the university to a great deal of expense as well. So something to bear in mind as we move forward. Regent Hsu, and then I have Regent Powell.
Thank you, Chair Rocha. My feeling, I think most people know what my feeling is. I think I was the one that kicked off the first discussion of this.
Mr. Chair, that's right.
I can't remember. I can't remember that far back. But the first comment I want to make is, I believe Secretary Steves made the comment that we saw the contract yesterday, coach's contract yesterday, that is would not be under policy. But I've always argued that the umbrella did cover that. And I think it still does. But going to the general transparency and thresholds that we're talking about, I would always argue for a lower threshold because, as we all know, we approved a lot of contracts yesterday without talking about them in the finance and operations meeting. And the fact that we have a record of them, the fact that we had the opportunity to see them and determine whether or not we had concerns about them, I think is good. I think all organizations struggle with this type of thing, and it changes. I mean, it's human behavior, human nature, that there are, opportunities to make purchases which contribute to the overall, financial situation. $1 million contracts add up if you have enough of them. And I think we just need to make sure that we at least have a chance to see these things, and especially when it comes to real estate. I believe real estate. I think we should see every real estate transaction, frankly, whether we're selling a little piece on the corner down the street, which actually could have huge strategic implications for how we develop the campus in the future, or a large property somewhere, like Newmore. Anything in Newmore, obviously, whether it's worth a lot of money or not, should come to us, and we should see the reasons for why we're buying or selling. So anyway, my general feeling is that $1 million is a pretty good number. I have in the past in other committees argued for a lower threshold, but I think in general $1 million is good.
Thank you. Regent Powell.
Thanks, Chair Rocha. I was going to move to a different topic. If you want to continue the discussion of real estate, I can stand by. Or
Regent Lucas, is your comment related to real estate?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Regent Powell.
Chair.
Regent Lucas.
Thank you, Chair Rocha. I echo the concerns that Regent Beeson and Regent Simmons have about the real estate. I think it needs a different look. I mean, I think we need to take that piece out and really think about what it means. For instance, schematic designs included in final review of projects seems a little bit backward to me. So I'm just suggesting that we take the real estate out and look at it as a separate entity.
Thank you. Executive Director Steves. Well, maybe I should go back to Regent Lucas. So do I understand, as we move forward into the next meeting where we would be reviewing this, or considering this for action, are you suggesting that the real estate component become a separate conversation, or is it a specific conversation that we would have to be prepared for action in February?
Yes, I think the second. I just think we should take a little time out and look at that and what it really means. Kind of, there's so many twists and turns in real estate. I think we should consider that before our next meeting.
All right, thank you. On this topic, Regent McMillan?
Yes, thank you, Chair Rocha. I concur with the fact I would not move forward on these real estate changes, and I've had firsthand experience with facilities now for a while, and where Regent, the three prior speakers and Regent Lucas landed is right where I'm at too. That doesn't feel like something we should be making sweeping changes to at this point, and we could leave what we have in place. I'm thinking of a procedural solution as we go towards February on that topic.
All right, thank you. All right, we'll move to Regent Powell.
Thank you, Chair Rocha. I also appreciate the work of the committee to improve the internal consistency of these thresholds, and I would like to thank the committee. I want to ask perhaps President Kaler to comment a little bit further on the impact of extending the thresholds to academic appointments. You commented on that earlier, and my understanding is that these would include these would include the multi-year component, whatever market forces are showing us in terms of what we'd have to offer, but also labs and postdocs. I mean, there's quite a bit that can eventually find its way into these controls. So I'd like you maybe to elaborate a bit more on that. I'd like to get your sense for how many of these academic appointments might come before us. I'm sure you don't know the exact number, but is it a few? Is it a lot? I'd just like to get a sense of that. And also what peer practice is in this area, because I am concerned about the potential impact on our competitiveness when we're out in the marketplace. So if, with your support, Chair Rocha, if we could hear from the President a little more detail on this topic.
Certainly. President Kaler.
Thank you, Chair Rocha. Regent Powell, I, as you suspect, don't have a crisp numerical answer to give you, but again, if you think about hiring an assistant professor in a technical or medical field, and you assume a pre-probationary hire of 5 to 7 years, a salary of roughly $100,000 average, 30% benefits, so that's $750 to begin with. Room modifications, purchasing of equipment, graduate students, etc., quite easily a $2 million hire. So then and again, we're trying to balance, I think, transparency and openness versus actually practically doing our jobs and running the place. So now you have a department chair who's negotiating with a faculty person, and he's got a package that's worth $1.9 million, and now he needs this, that, and the other, and it becomes $2.1 million. So now it's subjected to board approval when it wasn't before. Is that a competitive disadvantage? It's cumbersome, but you've got a little sentence in the letter that says subject to board approval, and the view in the world is that is fairly automatic. But again, part of my struggle with this is where does the board add value in doing that? Or is the board ever going to actually say, no, we don't want to hire this immunologist because it costs too much money? I don't think so. And I don't know that the board, as a governance role, has a space there, given that you've approved the budget for the Department of Immunology, and you're going to approve that person if and when they come up for tenure. So I'm just trying to find the right balance. I mean, at some level, the board approves everything because you approve our annual operating budget. And at what point do you say, we've approved your budget, go run the place and we'll see how you did, versus, oh, we need to check each little point along the way. And if you do a faculty position at to pick a number, $2 million threshold, there are going to be a lot of them. And I don't know where the board adds value in that stream. Maybe some of you can enlighten me on that, but I don't see it.
Follow-on question, Mr. Chair.
Regent Paul, please.
So, President Kaler, any sense of pure practice in this area, or anyone, in your team?
Yeah, the idea that a quote-unquote routine tenure-track faculty hire would be subjected to board review because of a $1 startup threshold, I've never heard of.
I think it would be helpful for the committee to not conflate, I think, the activity that's going on. I don't, particularly in light of the comments in the presentation, it is not my understanding that we would kind of informally lump together various costs associated with a hire. I think we're talking specifically about the contract itself with that individual. I understand that you've got lab costs and you've got to bring in some other, assistance that might cost the overall project to rise over $2 million. But I'm not aware of any practice that we would say, yes, we're hiring this individual, and then we're going to add everything that is associated with hiring that person. I think it's related to the specific contract. So I think it would be very helpful for the board over this period of review to have an actual demonstration of how many specific contracts associated with retaining personnel, whether it's a faculty hire or any other hire, that would actually constitute exposure of a certain dollar amount, whether it's $1 million or more, excuse me, in relation to Regent Shu's inquiry. I think that would be helpful to provide information as to what that actual impact is. I will suggest that as a basic principle, the oversight value of the board considering any matter is of value to the public and to the legislature that elects the board. Whether there's a more functional impact or what, I think it somewhat begs an imprudent question, because I don't think you want the value that we're adding to be actually making a judgment about what the decision should be. It's just basically that oversight check to make sure that it's consistent with our overall mission and doesn't have undue risk. I have Regent Shu, then Regent Anderson, and Regent Beeson. Regent Shu.
Actually, you've captured my
all right.
My comments.
Regent Anderson.
Chair Rocha, great discussion. Great discussion. I 100% agree with the oversight value of the board. President Kaler does bring up a good point that reminds me of my history in private enterprise. If we as a board are approving the overall budget and the budget for the Dean of School of Engineering, and he believes that hiring somebody at $1.5 million or $2.1 million, to use it, will be greater and getting more students and better benefit to the School of Engineering than hiring somebody at $1.2 million, which we don't approve. I understand the oversight, but I also have learned giving people in authority the tools to do their job and then letting them go with it will get better performance than if we look every step of the way. So I just want to balance that there is oversight, but there is also giving people the chance to lead will make them better leaders. Good point.
Regent Beeson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I would agree with Regent Simmons. My thinking has sort of evolved as it relates to adding the men's football and basketball coaches. I voted against earlier, but I think that the enormity of those contracts and the visibility and the optics, as some of you worded that, I think that probably makes sense. I don't really like to get in that space of us approving athletic coaches, but I think if I were to vote today, I would keep this fairly simple and add, going along with the president, just being very specific about the positions. We've got a pretty good list of positions now, and maybe adding those two. I would increase the commercial purchases up, but I agree with the whole comment about real estate. We need probably some time with Mr. Bertelsen. Somebody should, maybe the chair, the staff, whoever, just sort of talk through the thinking behind real estate. But I agree with Regent Hsu. Selling a very small sliver could be a big deal. And accepting gifts, as the chair was alluding to, accepting gifts, there is no free real estate. We know a certain piece of property that we accepted for $1 that has a lot of attendant costs. So this doesn't speak to that kind of the imputed value of donated real estate. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Regent Beeson. Regent Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and colleagues. Very intriguing discussion. Some observations. I think what we're talking about has to do with trust. Trust of the administration and trust of us in our ability to set forth a strategy and mission of this university. Having served on a few boards in the past and currently do, I'm always intrigued by what I call managing boards versus governing boards. I would prefer that this be a governing board, not a managing board. What do I mean by a managing board? Managing boards where individual board members or groups of board members get involved in intricate details of day-to-day operations, of appointments, of expenditures, so on and so forth. The truth of the matter is, we voted, and our predecessors voted, to hire President Kaler. He in turn put a management team together. If we don't have the trust of President Kaler and his senior management team, then we have an issue, and we ought to talk about it. But until that discussion were to take place, I'm on the side of a governing board that sets forth strategies, missions, and expectations. If you look at governing boards or managing boards in corporations or in business, I will tell you those organizations that their boards get too deep into the weeds will eventually have some problems. It's just the way it is. You know why? Because the management administration has this global look at the university. We get bits and pieces. Yes, we have information, but we get bits and pieces. But it's a matter of trust for me. And that trust is in the administration to carry out the policies and the strategies that we set forth. Now, in the matter of real estate, I agree about those decisions. Real estate is different than goods and services. You know, we bought $1 million worth of toilet paper, whatever. If we don't like it, we can change that next time around. You buy real estate, you're in fact stuck with it till you're going to develop it or someone else comes along to buy it from you. So I'm erring on the side of let's not get too deep into the weeds of management and these thresholds. Now, in the matters of the head basketball and football coach, I kind of where Regent Beeson is. I think they're such high profile that we need to take a look at them and cast our vote. As we look at our peers in other institutions, they're doing that. But let's not get too deep into the management of this university. Let's be a governing board. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for listening to my thoughts.
Thank you, Regent Johnson. Regent Cohen.
Thank you, Chair Rocha. I'm certainly in agreement with so many of my colleagues. First of all, I really liked what Regent Anderson said in that let's give our leadership tools to do the job and let them do the job. I think that's a really important point. I think Regent Johnson just brought up what was going through my mind, which is there is an element of trust. It's balancing trust with oversight. And I think I, for one, really want to be a governing board, not a managing board. And like Regent Beeson, I have been moved. I really didn't want to get into the ballgame of football or basketball and approving coaches' salaries, but I think they are very, very high profile, and maybe it is the obligation of our board to add those to the list. I do not think that we should be approving faculty salaries. That I don't want. I think that's up to the deans and to the overall budget to manage, and I don't think that that is really, I think it's getting into the management rather than the oversight arena. So I agree with many of my colleagues on those points.
Thank you, Regent Cohen.
Chair Rocha?
Regent Simmons.
Thank you. Just one point quickly I want to make, please. When I said that I was ready to approve the football and basketball coach, and there may be other similar positions, it was for two reasons. One is the high visibility, but the other is I think that marketplace is a mess. These are disproportionately compensated people because of market forces, and their contracts are highly unusual compared to the rest of our business. Now, whether we add value or not, for me, isn't the question. It's sharing in that responsibility, using our authority to share in the responsibility as we try to best, represent the interests of the people of Minnesota. So it's more than, please understand, it's more than just the visibility and public interest in those positions. It's the complexity of that particular marketplace, right?
Thank you. Regent Hsu.
Thank you, Chair Rocha. I agree with the trust part, and I also agree with the famous quote from Ronald Reagan that said, trust but verify. And I think that's our job. It's to verify. It's to make sure that things don't come off the rails. It's one thing to trust, but then to clean up a problem that has occurred because of that trust is something that takes a lot of energy that I think people don't want to get into. So transparency along the way. There aren't a lot of transactions, as we saw, that were under between the $1 and $2 million threshold. So I just think that it's better. We're better off looking at or having the opportunity to see it, having the opportunity to discuss it, rather than finding out years later that we approved something or had a chance to or didn't approve something that actually became a problem. So it's not like it's a huge amount of energy to make sure these things come to us. I've actually had people in the university come to me and they said, these are people who see the contracts and they said we should have lower thresholds so we can actually see some of these things that we're buying that we don't know about. So I think there's a balance. I think $1 million again is the number. And I would also say that we have a lot of opportunities to see this stuff, and if we choose not to discuss it and approve it anyway, it's really just fairly simple business. So.
All right, thank you. I was going to give Regent Sviggum the chance as the last remaining person at the table, but he stepped away. So, I'd like to make a few comments with respect to this dialogue, and I'll work with the Vice Chair. We'll see if we can put together something concrete to place in front of the board for the February discussion, and obviously we will have an opportunity to discuss again, and people can make their preferences known, and we'll come to a landing point that I think will let us move forward. I approach this a bit differently than some of my colleagues. We are first and foremost, we are a public institution, and there is a great deal of interest on the behalf of those that we represent in knowing that we are paying attention to matters and details. I would respond just briefly to Regent Anderson's comments. I don't see that having a threshold of review is inconsistent with good leadership, management, and governance. If you have a private enterprise yourself and you've hired someone to run it, and they come and say, well, I've decided I'm going to sell all of your facilities, and then you say, well, wait a minute, I don't want you to do that. That doesn't have the right direction for our organization. The response could be, well, you've hired me to manage and run this place. I mean, there's going to be a point where you're going to say, okay, this is a point at which we have a risk level. So the question is, what's the right risk level? As a public institution, I think that you have trust questions, and that as I said at the last meeting, I don't believe that the board exercising oversight over significant expenditures implies a lack of trust in the administration. I think that's an unhealthy perspective to suggest that does. I think that there's also a concept of respect for the board and the board's role as an oversight board as well as a governance board. I don't think exercising oversight, I mean, on the one hand, we're talking about not wanting to be in the business of the administration, but on the other hand, we're saying we want to review all real estate transactions. I mean, you could make that same argument. Well, we've hired you to handle this, so then you do what you wish. I don't think that's a consistent perspective. What I wanted to identify as we move forward was how many items are we actually talking about? Because my general perception would be that the administration, and this is a bit of a cultural transition that I was hoping we had made a little more progress on, doesn't perceive coming to the board for input or approval or even consent approval as being a hindrance, but actually as an asset to ensuring that the support of the board is there, particularly if issues arise in the future. And as we looked at the numbers, they're minuscule. When you look at the categories, if we were at $1 million threshold on all of these different items, you're talking about fewer than 2 items a meeting. And so even if it's simply on a consent agenda, I personally think that the value to the public to know that this board is ensuring that the public's representatives have some touch point for major expenditures. I think that's a huge value to this institution, and having the public believe that we are engaged in conducting that oversight that they have charged us to conduct. We heard that from the legislature this last session about specific expenditures and wanting to ensure that candidates were going to make sure that the board has that level of oversight. So what I would request, and I don't want to speak in emotions, I don't want to speak in generalities or presumptions of mixing in various expenses to kind of confuse the issue. I would like to know specifically what are because the numbers are so low that I don't think it certainly impacts us to put a couple of items on a consent agenda on a monthly basis. What are the specific competitive disadvantages? What are the specific operational impacts? We lost this contract because we couldn't wait 6 weeks to the next board meeting. If that part of this can be explained and articulated to the board, I'd be very interested, and I could be persuaded at various levels on really any of these topics. In the absence of that, my perception is $1 million is a lot of money to most folks. Out in the public, and so unless there's a compulsory or compelling reason for us to move differently, that would seem to be reasonable. I do respect my colleagues' transition on this issue of the coaches in particular, although I still think that it is a healthier perspective to simply say it's the financial risk as opposed to us taking over the management of who should be hired for which sport, because I don't think that's what our job is. I would also just simply raise that if you only name those, you could potentially have Title IX issues. That was what was raised 20-some years ago when that same prospect was put in front of us. So if we're going to do that, we need to make sure that we have an understanding that we're not favoring one gender's sports versus another. So with that, we've gone a little bit over time, but considering the bad penny analogy and wanting to finally come to some sort of a conclusion on this, I wanted to use this time to cover that. But I'll work with the vice chair of the board, of the committee rather, and the administration to make sure we have that information in front of us, and then we'll put something before the board and hopefully move forward. We'll move to the second agenda item, Board Operations Part 3, Legislative Reports and Presidential Performance Review, Evaluation and Compensation. Executive Director and Corporate Secretary Steves.
Mr. Chair, I will breeze through these slides in the interest of time, and there are a number of discussion questions which I know folks may want to weigh in on, and certainly I'll work through those all, and then if there are comments, you can reference any one of the questions. So this is today's review is the final review of board operations and agenda guidelines before the committee sees a complete rewrite or a red line version of that policy. Today we'll cover legislative reports, presidential performance review provisions, and finalize or complete or wrap up the discussion on agenda items that come to the board. With regard to legislative reports, as you know, the board is the entity that maintains the formal relationship with the other branches of state government and has the ultimate authority to accept and submit reports to those branches. The types of reports, however, as you may know, vary widely. They range from everything from the accountability report, which you'll be reviewing later today as a full board, to reports about specific topics such as aquatic invasive species or certain agricultural issues, and so they can be really broad or they can be quite narrow. The board does not currently have any criteria in policy to articulate which reports would come to the board for consideration and approval or submission to the legislature or the state, and which would not. Right now, the accountability report comes to the board. It is required, but there are not other reports that are named or any criteria that are named. And so, somewhat informally, these are the criteria that the board office and the administration have been using. Areas that impact the university's autonomy, things that reports that touch on that, or reports that touch on the performance of the university or its major initiatives. For instance, there's a report that is generated in compliance with the legislation that holds back a portion of the university's appropriation until it meets certain performance criteria. That's a report that comes to the board, though not required by policy. Academic planning and analysis, or management of university personnel, operations, or facilities. Those are kind of the informal categories that we've been working from that dictate which reports come. Reports that fall outside of those criteria are currently and could still be brought at the president's discretion based on what the nature of that report was or potential public relations issues associated with it. So, the question would be, at what level would the board like to engage with the legislative reports? Is there a desire to more clearly articulate which reports would come to the board or which would not in policy? Presidential performance review, this is a different category or different section of this policy. It defines the annual review process for the president, and it seeks to assess outcomes, strengthen performance, establish mutually agreed upon goals, inform annual compensation and other terms of employment. Those are articulated in the policy. It outlines some principles that guide that process. I won't go through those. Those are also from the policy. Those are what the Presidential Performance Review Committee looks at in terms of establishing the process that they will use to assess the president's performance each year. It really does leave the specific structure of the annual review up to the committee each year, and I would say that the committees in the past several years have really used that flexibility to shape and design the process in a way that meets whatever current needs the committee decides it wishes to emphasize. So that is the kind of the current nature of the policy. The policy also touches on compensation, and I won't go through all this, but I'll basically say that at the bottom line of it, it delegates to the chair, in consultation with the vice chair, the task of assessing the president's compensation, bringing forward recommendations for adjustments to compensation or adjustments to terms of employment. That's at the bottom line what it does. It also sets forth some principles around that. And that's what this slide touches on. So the question is, should there be any changes to the principles or processes that guide this review process or the setting of compensation? Or should there be, should there be any additional policy around how the Presidential Performance Review Committee conducts its work? Meeting procedures, we did review all of this last meeting and talked about how agenda items come as review or action, or review and action in a single meeting. And so I won't go through all of that. I'll simply turn to the questions, which is, should additional guidance or specific thresholds be established to clarify which types of items can come as review action in a single meeting? And should there be any additional guidance around what items can be included on a consent report, which in essence is the same thing as a review action in one meeting. And that's speedy.
Thank you. Director Steves, do we have any comments, thoughts, questions with respect to this matter? Regent Beeson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was thinking about the annual report to the legislature and wondering how many pages that first report would have been in the 1850s. Probably not 250 pages, but that's obviously the hallmark report that this board needs to be previewing and approving. I think, in general, my view on reports is, and I talked to the chair a little bit about this, is that it wouldn't hurt for the board to sort of be apprised when those go over the legislature, either placing them in our portal or copied somewhere in the board reports. I'm not personally interested in previewing those or having staff outline them. Those are very specific reports. I'm also wondering, there's maybe some blue laws on the book still where some of these reports really are no longer needed. And so having an inventory of what it is that we're doing, whether there's really a public purpose, and going back to the legislature and asking them to remove those from statute or from agreement. Thank you.
Thank you, Regent Beeson. Regent Simmons, give you an opportunity if you would like to step in.
I appreciate the opportunity, but I have nothing further to say.
Thank you, Regent Simmons. Any other member of the board? We're going to gain our time back here shortly. Mr. Steves, could you talk a little bit more, just briefly, about the issue of the review action and how that interplays with the way we as a board operate generally?
Mr. Chair, the way that process currently works is that during the agenda setting process, the board chair and the respective committee chairs are really working through and deciding which items will be coming, how those items will be coming, and whether they'll be for review or review action. So it's kind of a negotiated or agreed upon process between the administration and board or committee leadership at this point in time. So that's how it works right now.
Thank you. All right. Well, not to close out two topics with comments from the chair, but that's kind of where I'm sitting. As I look at the review action, and I don't see it doesn't seem to be like a huge burning issue for any specific member of the board right now. I think we can put together something that propose something that gives us some clarity. Obviously, our historic approach has been review in 1 month, action in another. That's impacted a little bit by the timing of our meetings now being where there's some longer spaces between meetings than others. But that seems to be a pretty good approach. And this, Regent Svigum has talked about wanting to make sure the public has access to what we talk about and that they have an opportunity for input. And so the big advantage of that is being able to review in a month, and then certainly anybody in the public will have a chance to interact with us based on conversations we may have had in the first month. At the same time, as we saw yesterday, sometimes you have matters where there really isn't a great question, at which point, my perspective is almost to the same kind of veto effect of a consent agenda. If any single member of the board wants to remain on the review action cycle, we would stay with that. But if the whole board is in agreement that we can move forward, taking into consideration the public's interest in providing input, we would have the ability to turn a review followed by action into a review action in the same meeting with a unanimous vote of the board. That would be a suggestion that I would put before the board to consider and putting into our procedures. Regent McMillan, I yield to your
Thank you, Chair Rocha. I think what you just said reflects my governance philosophy around review action, and as the administration knows well from time on in the facilities arena, I don't like review and action as a general rule. I think it gets back to the topic we just closed out and what is our role, and I think we do a better job when we review 1 month and act the next month, knowing sometimes that's a 3-month cycle. And I thought your use of an example, there's times when it's very appropriate, and if the full board agrees, a review action can be done. Sometimes, there's the specific categories of transactions too. Real estate's one of those tough ones where you have if we review something in March and then they can't act until May, that isn't the way the real estate world works. So there's classes of activity that I think lend themselves to review and action, but as a general governance principle, the way we operate today with an intentional break between the review and the action is a very good governance practice. So I don't have much to add to what you just said, and I thought the coaching contract yesterday was a great example of when you pull up and say, we're not going to wait till the next month, we'll do it now.
Thank you. Further comments on this topic? All right, we're back on schedule. Thank you, Mr. Steves. We'll move to our third item, committee charges, Audit and Compliance Committee. We'll ask Chief Auditor Gail Klatt and Maggie Flotten, Board Associate Communications and Committees, to join us. The floor is yours in whichever order you choose.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, members of the committee. Chief Auditor Klatt and I are here to discuss the draft committee charge, as you said, for the Audit and Compliance Committee, which is included in your docket materials on page 66. The Board Office and Internal Audit have worked in close collaboration to develop the draft language for the committee's consideration. Today's conversation is the third in a series of discussions to define charges for the board's new committee structure that was adopted last June. And although the Audit and Compliance Committee is not a new committee, now is a good opportunity to review the current charge and refine language to be included in proposed amendments to Board of Regents policy, board operations, and agenda guidelines, which is slated for your review in the spring. Currently, the Audit and Compliance Committee charge is outlined in 2 Board of Regents policies, the Audit Committee Charter and BOAG. In working with Chief Auditor Klatt, the proposed language consolidates both policies and would repeal the Audit Committee Charter by integrating all of its content into BOAG. In other words, the repeal of the charter only changes the standalone policy status and does not affect the board's charge to the Audit and Compliance Committee. The proposed changes also respond to a directive of this committee to streamline Board of Regents policies. Additionally, we looked at our peers in the Big Ten, and all but one of their audit committee charges are included in their policy or in their bylaws with their other committees. Only Wisconsin had a separate policy outlining their committee charge. So now we'll just walk through the draft language that appears in your docket materials, and you'll note that the structure is similar to other committee charges. The first section is the general description of the committee, which includes the broad duties. The second section, though, is unique to the Audit and Compliance Committee as it defines the authority that the board has delegated to the Audit and Compliance Committee, and other board committees don't have such authority. Going down to the third section, this identifies the action items that come to the committee for recommendation to the full board, and you'll see here there are both cross references to Board of Regents policy, reservation and delegation of authority, as well as specific items spelled out in that list there. And Chief Auditor Klatt's going to outline the rest.
Thank you.
I will continue with the fourth and fifth sections of the charge as it's currently drafted, and then I would like to just make some overall comments as well. So in the fourth section of the committee charge as written, it lays out the various areas that the Audit and Compliance Committee has oversight responsibilities for, primarily those of the internal audit function, the independent audit function, risk management, identification, and mitigation processes, and the institutional compliance program. And again, with the recent changes mention the name of the committee, it's important to call out the oversight responsibilities over the compliance program as well. All of these oversight responsibilities were included are included in the audit committee charter, and so they're captured here as well. And then the 5th section lays out all the various reports that the Audit and Compliance Committee receives. And again, those were included in the charter and provide the necessary oversight by the committee of important documents that speak to the internal controls and financial reporting of the University of Minnesota. I would like to say that these documents are really important to the audit function at the University of Minnesota because of its unique relationship to the board. Our authority comes directly from the board. The board reserves to itself the authority for the audit function. So these are really important documents. I appreciate that the board is interested in streamlining its documentation and is interested in consistency. I would ask that you be thoughtful about the removal of the audit charter. I keep a pretty good pulse on where governance organizations are, and I would expect there's not too many organizations that currently are thinking about removing an audit committee charter. So I certainly am supportive of whatever direction the board wants to go. I would just put that out there as my professional opinion as your chief auditor.
Thank you. Regent Cohen.
Thank you, Chair Rocha. Well, I'm glad you addressed that point, Auditor Klatt, because my question is, are there any disadvantages to leaving the charter as it is and also putting it into the board operations?
Auditor Klatt.
I'm not sure I'm the one to answer that question.
All right. Is there anybody who'd like to take a?
I will call on Executive Director Steves.
Mr. Chair, Regent Cohen, I think that as a fundamental principle, one of the things that we've been trying to strive for is not having the exact same topic addressed in more than one place in board policy. And right now we have that occurring with the audit committee having both authorities outlined in board operations and agenda guidelines, and then an entirely separate policy which is giving it additional authorities and responsibilities. The objective of the language that's in front of the committee for consideration today, I mean this is just a discussion today, was simply responsive to previous guidance that the board office got from the Governance and Policy Committee that one, where possible, where it doesn't have an impact, it would be nice to reduce and streamline the board's number, the number of policies the board has. Right now, I think it's at 92. When I started here 8 years ago, it was 93. So we've made one, or maybe two. Maybe it was 94. So maybe we've done 2 policies in that time. So where possible, we could try to streamline. And the second being that other principle about trying to not have the same topics discussed in 2 places.
Regent Cohen.
Thank you, Chair Rocha. I think it's important because, and I'm not saying this just because I'm the audit chair, that the importance of the audit committee to our university, and so I'm hesitant. My own perspective is that to remove that charter of the audit committee, which I think is very valuable. And so as we weigh it, perhaps having that in place is worth having an additional, having it in 2 places in this instance, and that's up for the rest of the board to decide.
Regent Simmons, did you want to address the topic?
Well, I was hoping that, thank you, Chair Rocha. I really would like to hear from Auditor Klatt, because I do think she's in the best possible position based on her experience and contact with the rest of the nation to comment on whether this would in any way reduce the effectiveness of the audit function of the board, because this is different. The audit committee is very different than the rest of our committees. So like Regent Cohen, I share desire to single it out in some way, and I don't know if charter is the right way or not, but I'd sure like to hear from the auditor.
Thank you, Regent Simmons. Before turning the floor over to Chief Auditor Klatt, my sense is that there are very positive points to be made on either side. The clarity in our policy with respect, and then recognizing this. I see great merit in Regent Cohen's perspective. Particularly, I look at it from the standpoint that it has this unique authority directly from the board that does make it quite unique and can give a basis for that. Auditor Klatt, you can either speak directly to this question now, but as opposed to putting you on the spot, we can certainly have this conversation going forward if you want to provide it, but I would certainly welcome your comments and feedback right now if you would so choose.
Thank you, Chair Rocha. My knowledge of other higher education institutions, and I'll speak to that first and then broader, is most of our peer institutions have very similar language as is being proposed for the audit committee charge included in their bylaws or other governance documents, so that's very consistent. I would also say, with very few exceptions, they also all have an additional audit committee charter. They're not included in their policies, but they're included in however they capture their governance documents. So that's certainly a possibility as well. But the vast majority have both types of documentation. In the broader landscape, my experience and interaction with others is most audit committees and organizations are challenged by strengthening their audit committee charters, not removing them. And I don't, to the question of will this have an impact, I think the information that's included in the audit committee charge, the board office was very responsive to my input into that, and I think it's certainly functional, and it certainly covers the major topics of the audit and compliance committee's work. I don't think it does it in the degree of detail that the audit committee charter does. I think today that certainly does not give me great concern, because we have people who have functioned under the charter serving on that committee, so they understand that. Over time, I don't know what that would be. I don't think, like I say, I think the terminology, the content of the audit committee and audit and compliance committee's charge provide guidance to the committee and is certainly workable. And so it's just, the board has to just think about kind of the optics of it and the messaging, considering that it's a function that you've reserved your authority to yourself.
Thank you. We're slightly over time. If anyone has a burning desire, otherwise I would just simply ask for clarification from Director Steves, because I was not tracking that we were removing a charter. I understood it as a kind of consolidating language, which again is an open discussion whether there's a value in leaving it as standalone, particularly the importance of the audit committee to reflect the fact that we are minding the store. Regent Steves, can you provide any real quick clarification on that point?
Mr. Chair, I got a promotion there.
What did I just call you?
In terms of clarification, I think in the interest of time, we probably can just simply continue this conversation leading up to the next meeting. It is certainly, I guess in my view, exactly what Chief Auditor Klatt said. It's simply a matter of optics. Having an additional document having two documents, having one document has absolutely no operational impact on the audit committee. So it's clearly just a matter of, if the board wishes to have two documents, we'll have two documents. If you'd like one document, we'll have one.
Regent Beeson,
I don't want to steamroll over an anthill here, but we could preserve the charter language in its entirety but place it inside this policy. I like it in one place rather than something floating. So I like that original idea, but I also appreciate the charter is the charter. The charter is the most defining part of it and should drive the policy.
Right. Thank you. And I think we can probably work together with the office to make sure that we have some information, and certainly welcome the input of all members of the board. We'll move to our final item, Committee Charges, Governance and Policy Committee. Commander Steves.
Mr. Chair, I was going to talk about this charge, but now I'm thinking maybe we need a Governance and Policy Committee charter. So, sorry. The language in your docket is draft language for consideration that would be a charge to this committee. And we saved this one for last so that you could see all of the other ones and then take all the best ideas and put them in here. But this one, it outlines, it's very brief in that it really is about this committee ensuring the integrity and high performance of the board. And it outlines ways that this committee would do that, such as guiding the board to articulate a clear vision for the university, clarify reserved and delegated authorities, thoughtfully consider risk, establish institutional benchmarks and performance measures, really all of the very best governance practices that this board is already doing. And so it outlines that and then specifically outlines the things that this committee would recommend around policy and areas where it would provide oversight.
Thank you. This is for discussion. Is there any discussion by members of the committee? Regent Simmons, did you have any comments with respect to this item?
Thank you, no.
I would just note that the Vice Chair vetoed my proposal to add a quarterly review of the board's chair and vice chair to the governance policy charter, but
the board or the committees?
We're open to that conversation, Mr. Chair. All right. Well, that's great. So please take that under consideration, and certainly to the board office or to the vice chair or myself, you can provide any feedback that you might have with respect to this apparently very non-controversial topic. And that concludes the governance and policy agenda for today. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
All in favor?
Aye. Aye.
We are adjourned.
Wow, look at that. Very good.